We move now to slide A4, Oswald's defection to the USSR, how and why his files were hidden. On Halloween Day, 31 October 1959, Lee Harvey Oswald, who was a false defector, walked into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and asked for Soviet citizenship. Well before that, a block inside the CIA was already in place to control any files on Oswald coming from other government agencies to the CIA were blocked and only allowed to go to the CIA's Office of Security. Between 1951 and 1963, the number of security office personnel increased from 35 to 700. By 1959, the security office had become a sprawling organization with numerous offices that would have something to provide to the mole hunt. Ultimately, the director and deputy director of the security office, Sheffield Edwards, the director, and Robert Bannerman, the deputy director, would decide where the nerve center of responsibility for the mole hunt would reside. In 1959, the security office had 6 staff-level components sitting above the division and office-level elements. These 6 staffs that reported directly to the director and deputy director included inspection, foreign support, administration and training, policy, alien affairs, and most important, security research. Because the search for Popov's mole was endless, the idea of the Angleton mole hunt hypothesis is not supported by the evidence. On 8 August 1994, I interviewed Bob Bannerman. He told me that the Security Research Staff, SRS, was under his direct supervision, i.e. was his own staff, my staff, he used the term. In 1959, under the SRS chief Paul Gaynor, the research branch was run by Bruce SOLIE. Bannerman told me Jim Angleton was in on this. Although Bannerman emphasized security office cooperation with Angleton's staff and others, that should not be taken to mean that Angleton had the lead. Being in on an operation means only as a participant. It does not mean being the office of primary concern. The office of primary concern for researching defectors and false defectors and moles and all CIA personnel was the security office. OS shared only what they deemed appropriate with Angleton's counterintelligence staff. The security office data on Soviet defectors was normally shared routinely and at the same time with the counterintelligence staff and the Soviet Russia division. But that's not what was taking place. So Bannerman told me, quote, we were calling in all the people in all the areas, he said, who might have something. As to which people in the security office were involved, Bannerman recalled, we had a certain amount, most of my staff, that's the SRS. Bannerman emphasized that Paul Gaynor on his staff was acting in handling that end of the business along with Bruce SOLIE, who's head of the research branch. CIA documents and registers clearly reveal all incoming messages and cables on Oswald from other government agencies, we call them OGAs, did not go where they normally would, to the Soviet Russia division. Instead, they were all confined to the Office of Security by the Office of Mail Logistics, the OML, and Records Integration Division. Then, the security office decided what to share or not to share with the counterintelligence staff about the mole hunt. SOLIE designed a false mole hunt to protect himself, the mole. He excluded the Soviet Russia division on the false grounds that the mole was over there. The Office of Mail Logistics and Records Integration Division had to have paved the way before Oswald arrived, or nothing would have worked the way SOLIE wanted it to. All of this was necessary to ensure tight control of all incoming files on Oswald's defection from other government agencies to his security office file, OS 351164, would have been held by Bruce SOLIE. By statute, the FBI had the jurisdiction for investigating and prosecuting Americans and foreigners in America, but they'd have a hard time doing that on Oswald and his mission to the Soviet Union. On 2 November 1959, 2 days after Oswald's defection scene in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, the FBI liaison to the CIA, Sam Papich, telephoned the CIA counterintelligence liaison, Jane Roman, asking about this ex-Marine who recently defected to the USSR. Roman had no immediate answer for Papich and would not get back to him until midweek. OML and RID made certain that before Oswald's arrival in the USSR, the other government agency files would be sent only to the Office of Security. Bruce SOLIE was the wizard behind the curtain. On 2 November 1959, CIA liaison Jane Roman did check CIA Systems and Records Integration Division indexing to run traces on Oswald. Oswald's documents register revealed that a 2 November CIA liaison internal note indicated there had been an oral FBI name check request. Of course, that was the request from the FBI liaison to the CIA, Sam Papich. Jane Roman's note also stated that she had received a no-record reply dated 4 November. And on that date, Bruce SOLIE wrote a memo saying, quote, Mr. Papich was advised that we had no info on subject, that would be Oswald. SOLIE's denial that the Office of Security had any information on Oswald's defection made certain that the Bureau, the FBI, remained firmly out of the loop. Except for the morsels Angleton was let in on, the Soviet Russia Division and the rest of the clandestine services were all out of the loop. Much later, bells would ring when Bagley found out all about this. SOLIE was running the show. He told a bald lie to both the CIA liaison and the FBI liaison. The telling moment when Bagley later found out. Only 5 decades later did Bagley recognize the documentary basis for the extraordinary late 1959 files caper during which those other government agency documents arrived at the CIA. At that time, Bagley was far away from CIA headquarters. He had been working since March 1958 as an operations officer in the CIA station in Bern, Switzerland, and he didn't receive a headquarters assignment until the fall of 1962. Not until 50 long years had passed with the stars aligned, Bagley had become close friends with Malcolm Blunt, a British researcher. In 2012, 2 years before his death, Bagley finally learned about the 1959 files caper in the CIA's Office of Security. In Bagley's home in Brussels that Malcolm had often visited, Malcolm laid out in front of Pete, piece by piece, all of the documents demonstrating the restrictions on the Oswald paper trail by the Security Office's security research staff after Oswald's defection in 1959. In 2019, the details of this incredibly seminal moment were told publicly for the first time in my Volume 3, Into the Storm. Bagley, however, was a very quick study. As soon as Blunt put the defection records and their original locations in front of Bagley, right out of the blue, Bagley asked Malcolm, okay, was he witting or unwitting? Bagley knew Malcolm wouldn't have any trouble understanding that who he was referring to was Oswald. So Blunt replied, you can't ask me that question. How would I know? At this, and raising his voice, Bagley responded, no, you have to know. Was he witting or unwitting? Well, Malcolm had little choice but to proffer a guess. With some reluctance, Malcolm replied, okay, unwitting. At that, and with even firmer emphasis, Bagley countered, oh no, he had to be witting. Malcolm believes that in That instant, Bagley saw that this high school dropout, a nothing, a nobody, may have indeed been utilized by the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald had been a witting false defector. Malcolm's friendship and courage to show the Oswald other government agency documents to Pete Bagley was a telling moment. In sum, the CIA has never officially acknowledged that Oswald was sent to the USSR as a false defector. The fact that a senior counterintelligence officer of Bagley's stature concluded on the spot that Oswald was a witting false defector was a long way in overturning that orthodoxy. The provenance of the evidence indicating that Oswald was an agent for the Ukrainian KGB will be discussed later in this briefing. That subject is also covered in detail in Chapter 3 of Uncovering Popov's Mole. All right, we now go to slide set A5. Oswald's defection to the USSR and his return to America. U.S. clandestine sources on Oswald inside of the USSR, on his electronics training in November 1959, and with respect to his 201 file opening in December 1960. An early U.S. clandestine source on Oswald in the USSR, 59 to 60, that involves John McVickar and Priscilla Johnson. McVickar worked with SNYDER in the American Embassy Consular Office in Moscow. During mid-November 1959, McVickar welcomed Priscilla Johnson back from a visit to the United States and told her that an American who was staying at her hotel was trying to defect. He had refused to speak with any of us, McVickar said. He added that Oswald would probably speak to her just because she was a woman. That evening, she interviewed Oswald in her room. McVickar felt that the chief consul, he didn't get along very well with him, and he told Priscilla this, that the chief consul, SNYDER, had mistreated Oswald in an argument over his request to defect. SNYDER was angry with McVickar and told the Warren Commission, I didn't ask him to talk to Priscilla. But McVickar was not finished talking to her. On 17 November, he invited Priscilla to talk about her Oswald interview over dinner. It was a date. McVickar returned to his embassy office that night, however, to write a memo to files about their conversation. And on 19 November, he wrote a strange postscript to the 17 November memo about Johnson and Oswald. McVickar used Johnson to hide his access to a source. The memo and postscript are both disingenuous obfuscations of the sequence of events and the source for information on what Oswald would be doing in the Soviet Union. Whatever McVickar's motives were for writing this document, it inadvertently provides evidence for an early clandestine source on Oswald in the USSR. This is a clip from his postscript. P.S. Priscilla Johnson told me since, that means at a new meeting after our other one, that Oswald has been told he will be leaving the hotel at the end of this week, that he will be trained in electronics, that she has asked him to keep in touch with her. Well, Johnson had said nothing of the sort to McVickar about any electronics training assignment for Oswald, and yet Oswald was to be sent to an electronics factory in Minsk. As of 19 November, however, no one at the American Embassy in Moscow should have known that that was the case. Because McVickar knew about it, he must have had a Soviet source. Oswald didn't find out about it until January, 5 weeks later, that he would be sent to Minsk to receive training in an electronics factory. McVickar probably hit a tip from a USSR source on Oswald and passed it on to covert CIA agents working in Moscow. The wording of the postscript also gave the appearance of another Johnson meeting with Oswald, whether after the 16 November interview in the hotel or their dinner date. The Warren Commission cleared up that point. There was not another meeting. Moreover, the House Select Committee on Assassinations cleared up McVickar's incorrect attribution of the electronics training tip to Priscilla Johnson. When I brought the whole 19 November postscript business up to SNYDER in 1994 in an interview, he found the electronics training tip, quote, fascinating, unquote. And he asked me, how did McVickar find it out? It wasn't known to me. Since he purported to get it from Priscilla, where did she get it from? And if she didn't tell him, where the hell did John get it from? In a 14 July 1994 interview with me, Priscilla said, if I thought he was going to write it up, I would not have said anything to him about the interview. I would not have liked the idea that it was going to be going out as a report from me. This episode is not the only indication of a possible U.S. penetration of KGB or other Soviet sources during Oswald's stay in the USSR. December 1960, and a likely American source in the USSR. Oswald's CIA 201 file was opened on 9 December 1960, 13 months after his defection in Moscow. The official CIA explanation about why it was opened at that time is not convincing. The CIA claims that on 25 October 1960, it responded to a request for information from the State Department about 12 U.S. defectors to the Soviet bloc. Oswald's name just happened to be on that list. In 1978, the CIA assured the House Select Committee on Assassinations that the State Department request was why they opened the 201 file on Oswald so late. Doesn't make any sense. The 1992 passage of the JFK Assassination Records Act uncovered a high-level CIA document that demolished the agency's claim. The CIA knew about that before the State Department request. They knew about the 201 opening. Oswald had asked the U.S. Embassy to help him return to America, and the CIA knew that was the reason his 201 file had been opened back in the previous year, in 25 October 1960. After Angleton was fired in 1974, the new release of JFK records revealed the real reason for Oswald's 201 opening. In a 1975 memorandum, George Calaris, who had replaced Angleton as the chief of the CIA counterintelligence staff, inadvertently let slip during his first weeks on duty a probable U.S. penetration in the USSR. Here's a clip from what he said in that memo. Lee Harvey Oswald's 201 file was first opened under the name Lee Henry Oswald. The Henry, middle name Henry thing is not something we have time to deal with here. Under the name Lee Henry Oswald on 9 December 1960. 9 December 1960, as a result of his defection to the USSR on 31 October 1959. And renewed interest in Oswald brought about by his queries concerning possible reentry to the United States. Quotes are in the original, quote marks. Thus, Oswald's defection and his queries about coming home were the reasons, both of them were the reasons that the CIA opened his 201 file. And that had happened back in December 1960, not in 1961. Moreover, Oswald's first request to the U.S. Embassy was in December 1960, as was his 201 opening. So, Calaris's quotation marks around the word defection render it weird. Maybe it's a possible false defection. Anyway, whatever. This all suggests that the CIA had access to an early letter sent to the U.S. Embassy by Oswald and confiscated by the KGB. But like the Warren Commission, the House Select Committee went along with it, said they believed the United States government did not know where Oswald was until 13 February 1961. That just doesn't square with the facts. Oswald told SNYDER that his December 60 letter stated, I would like to go back to the U.S. Yeah. The House Select Committee examined the Calaris memo and with a single sentence dismissed his contention that Oswald's inquiries triggered his 201 opening in early December 1960. Quote, there is no indication that Oswald expressed to any U.S. government official an intention to return to the United States until mid-February 1961, when he sent a request to the U.S. Embassy for permission to return to the United States. Some of those things are true statements, all of which ignoring a whole bunch of more important facts. The House Select Committee final report failed to notice or check into two glaring signs present in Oswald's records. First, the opening sentence of Oswald's mid-February letter explained it all. It said, "Since I have not received a reply to my letter of December 1960, I'm writing again." Moreover, when the chief counsel, Richard SNYDER, received Oswald's second letter, he replied that Oswald's earlier letter, quote, "does not appear to have been received at this embassy." The point is, SNYDER had not excluded the existence of Oswald's first letter with that statement. After the Cold War, the CIA would be embarrassed when Russia opened its archives to the American news media. The first letter was removed by the KGB and never sent to the U.S. Embassy. We know for certain now the KGB intercepted the letter and never put it back in the mail to the embassy. The story that it was still in the KGB Oswald files after the fall of the Soviet Union was first broken by ABC News Nightline on 22 November 1991. During that program, hosted by Ted Koppel, the subject of Oswald's missing letter to the American embassy came up. Forrest Sawyer revealed this. On 13 February 1961, the U.S. Embassy received a letter from Oswald that read, "Since I have not received a reply to my letter of December 1960, I'm writing again." What letter was referring to? Theorists have speculated he never did write it, that he was simply unstable or lying. In fact, the KGB intercepted Oswald's missing first letter, and the original still exists inside the Oswald file. ABC News later verified the existence of the missing letter in Oswald's KGB files. ABC News just overturned another orthodoxy. Okay, I'm going to turn now to a short tidbit on the arrival of the Oswald family in the United States. That's Marina Oswald in the upper left-hand corner. On 13 June 1962, Oswald, along with his wife Marina and his daughter June, disembarked from the Mazdam in Hoboken, New Jersey, after meeting with the Travelers Aid Society. On 14 June, the Oswald family flew from New York to Fort Worth, Texas. On 26 June, the day when the FBI first interviewed Oswald, he walked into the Commercial Employment Agency and applied for a job, and he lied, saying he had gone to Moscow working for the State Department. Go figure. For the Oswald show with the FBI during the rest of the year, see the section, The Unworthy Oswald, in chapter 15 of my Oswald and the CIA. Summary. The CIA had clandestine KGB or other Soviet sources in the USSR on Oswald that they were protecting. The Deputy U.S. Consul, John McVickar, used Priscilla Johnson to hide his access to a source or sources on Oswald in Moscow. After the Cold War, ABC News reports on Oswald's letters to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow also indicated that the CIA had a clandestine KGB source in the Soviet Union. All right, now we're going to move along to slide set A6. The 1962 false defection of Nosenko, Yuri Nosenko, in Geneva, Switzerland, at a disarmament conference. A misdirection to protect Bruce SOLIE, the KGB mole, in the CIA. The May 1962 KGB provocation in Geneva. In December 1961, the time bomb that had been ticking since GOLITSYN's defection in 1958 confirmed Popov's claims about a staff-level KGB penetration of the CIA, and things finally exploded. By the spring of 1962, the Cold War was well on its way to the edge of a nuclear Armageddon. The leads that Golitsyn had given Angleton and CIA officer Dave Murphy in January 1962 were so damaging that the KGB immediately began designing a plan to launch a deception to discredit Golitsyn's leads. What was at stake for the KGB was nothing less than protecting the identity of their prized mole in the CIA. And so from January to May 1962, intrigue and confusion reigned on both sides. Yuri Guk, Alexander Kislov, Mikhail Tsimbal, I.S. Mayorov, all these guys are in Geneva at the time that the CIA is about to be hit with a provocation by the KGB using that guy there in the upper left-hand corner, Yuri Nosenko, who was pretty much of an idiot. Oleg Gribanov was the head of the KGB Second Chief Directorate. His deception agents, Yuri Guk and Alexander Kislov, accompanied Nosenko to support his fake defector in place provocation in Geneva. Second Chief Directorate Officer Vladislav Kovshak was back in Moscow. His job was working against the Americans there at the embassy. And then there was Mikhail Tsimbal, who directed the important KGB illegal section in Moscow. Tsimbal, accompanied by Mayorov, went to Geneva with the KGB delegation before Nosenko's sessions with Bagley and Kieswalter began at the Geneva Disarmament Conference. Now, Guk and Kislov stayed close to and supported Nosenko's deception operation against Bagley and Kieswalter. But Tsimbal and Mayorov secretly slipped away to Paris while Bruce SOLIE was there. Tsimbal and Mayorov, as Bagley later learned, had gone to Paris, quote, to meet KGB spies high inside the French intelligence service, unquote. They could easily hide this group of guys from Moscow in the Paris KGB residency because Tsimbal had been the chief of the residency there just before leaving and going to his illegals assignment in Moscow. Paris was the place where the KGB mole and the CIA could safely meet with KGB agents from Moscow. GRIBANOV had learned the details of Angleton's debrief of Golitsyn for the 62 provocation. Golitsyn later in 1964 told Angleton and Murphy that back in March 1962, GRIBANOV found it difficult to create Nosenko's script for the Geneva provocation against the CIA. Why? Because the situation wasn't clear enough to do it. But by June, Golitsyn added, again in 64, but back in June of 1962, Golitsyn said the situation had become clearer and Nosenko had finally received his instructions to be introduced to you, the CIA, as a provocateur. Well, how GRIBANOV had received such clarifying information was what was on Golitsyn's mind in 64. Thinking back on things, it was most likely that the information had been acquired at the clandestine KGB gathering in Paris, 1962, during that Geneva conference, and then reported to GRIBANOV by a messenger sent to Moscow. SOLIE, who was in Paris at that time in 1962, knew the details of Golitsyn's January interview with Angleton, who told SOLIE everything he knew. By the way, we know this from SOLIE's travel records. When SOLIE traveled anywhere in Europe, he always spent 2 days at least in Paris. Revising Nosenko's script, the last minute for his 1962 CIA contact in Geneva. In 1964, this is a couple of years later, but in 1964, Anatoly made an extraordinarily telling remark to his CIA interrogators that concerned 1962, and it's worth putting in the Klieg lights. In the 64 look back, he explained that the clear situation in June 1962 had been the result of, quote, some more information from you, I mean the United States, unquote. Because Golitsyn was talking with the CIA's counterintelligence chief, his use of the pronoun you leaves no doubt that he meant there was a direct covert channel of communication going on from the CIA to the KGB. The problem, although it was left unstated, was the likelihood that the leak had come from Angleton, who shared GOLITSYN's analysis with SOLIE. After the Cold War, many of GOLITSYN's leads were independently attested to by Bagley, who learned the details from his KGB contacts. The point is that the leads in GOLITSYN's January 62 interrogation by Angleton had to be acquired by the KGB to use for Nosenko's first contacts in May and June in Geneva with Bagley and Kieswalter. This episode is one of the many during the Cold War that underlines the case that SOLIE was probably the KGB mole in the CIA. Two job offers for Sergei Kondrashev. In the summer of 1961, Ivan AGAYANTS was head of the KGB First Chief Directorate, Disinformation Operations Department D. He was also one of the most respected officers in the history of Soviet intelligence. Knowing that the end of Sergei Kondrashev's tour in Vienna was approaching, AGAYANTS invited him to Moscow to be his deputy. Before reporting for duty as AGAYANTS deputy in early March 1962, right at the time that conference is going on in Geneva, Kondrashev received another invitation, this time to visit Second Chief Directorate Chief GRIBANOV in his office. There, GRIBANOV said he was, quote, launching a complex deception operation against the CIA and wanted Kondrashev to help him run it. Now, wait a minute here. The CIA has always refused any idea that Nosenko was a fraud and this was a deception. They always have said up to the present day that Nosenko told the truth. Well, wait a minute. Here you have GRIBANOV saying that this guy working for him was to launch a deception operation. If Sergey would come to the second chief director for this, GRIBANOV said, he would make him his deputy, a post carrying the rank of a one-star general. GRIBANOV knew that Nosenko was a philandering drunk and that a world-class counterintelligence officer was needed for Geneva to carry out a deception operation. Nosenko would need help. Kondrashev made the right decision. Stay with AGAYANTS. When Kondrashev visited AGAYANTS to talk over the situation about the GRIBANOV offer, he recalled sensing that the latter, AGAYANTS, already knew about the deception plan GRIBANOV was preparing for Geneva. And so, let's put it this way. In March, A minor, second chief directed Moscow officer was temporarily assigned. That would be Nosenko, of course, was temporarily assigned as a watchdog for the Soviet delegation to a disarmament conference in Geneva. At the end of May, Yuri Nosenko did something that would forever play a central role in the investigation of the assassination of JFK. He volunteered to spy for the CIA. Kondrashev knew GRIBANOV's plan could blow up, and it did. So he decided to stay with AGAYANTS, and GRIBANOV had no choice but to go ahead with his complex deception plan in Geneva with a nut job like Nosenko. Afterwards, Kondrashev realized how his skyrocketing career would have hit a dead end if he had accepted GRIBANOV's offer. Nosenko told lie after lie to Bagley and Kieswalter at the Geneva 2 conference. At the first session in late May 1962, Nosenko told Pete Bagley that one of the other men in his hotel room was named Alexander Kislov. He said, just a journalist with nothing to do with the KGB. Well, of course, the CIA later learned that Kislov worked for the KGB under GRIBANOV. Another lie at the first session was when Nosenko showed Bagley pictures of his daughters. Nosenko said, look, I just got these from my wife, Gook. Was back in Moscow for a few days with my wife and asked him to bring them to me. The pictures were a distraction from the desperate trip Gook made back to Moscow for last-minute adjustments with GRIBANOV and to Nosenko's script for the CIA in Geneva. Nosenko's answer to the CIA was so ridiculous that it really shows how ill-prepared and slow on his feet he was, let alone being a drunk. A surprise challenge for Pete Bagley. The biggest whopper in all of Nosenko's meetings came during the first session. After several glasses of whiskey, Bagley challenged Nosenko to provide the most important thing he could tell the CIA. Nosenko replied, "I know the most important American spy the KGB ever recruited in Moscow, a sergeant in your embassy, a cipher mechanic, codenamed Andre." In the next meeting, Nosenko was desperate to walk back that claim. In front of Bagley and Kieswalter, Nosenko declared, "We never managed to recruit any American code clerk." Oops. The closest we ever came was Andre. When the FBI caught up with Andre, they knew right away he was no threat. He hadn't done anything. They let him retire in peace. Nosenko was fumbling so much that Guk probably had to consult with Moscow about revising the script. And here's another huge whopper that Nosenko told to Bagley about his job in Moscow. When Bagley asked Nosenko to describe his job in Moscow, Nosenko made his fourth mistake in as many minutes. He replied that until a few weeks before leaving for Geneva, he had been the number 2 man in the section operating against the American embassy in Moscow. Years later, that position never existed. Anyway, years later, no less than 4 authoritative KGB officers would state that Nosenko never held such a position. They included, of course, Anatoly Golitsyn, Sergey Kondrashev, but also Roman Markov, a leading member of the Moscow U.S. Embassy section, and Oleg Kalugin, who had headed the KGB counterintelligence staff for a while. The above lies are a small sample of those that Nosenko told Bagley and Kieswalter in their 5 sessions during the Geneva Disarmament Conference. Summary. Nosenko's 1962 defection in Geneva was a deception to protect the KGB mole in the CIA, Bruce SOLIE. GRIBANOV learned the details of ANGLETON'S debrief of GOLITSYN from SOLIE. And then Nosenko, of course, once they got together in Geneva, told lie after lie after lie to Bagley and Kieswalter.